Why does America hate my mom? The words didn't come from a politician, a lawyer, or a protester. They came from a 6-year-old girl, small hands, tired eyes, a voice barely louder than a whisper. And in that congressional hearing room, filled with charts, cameras, and cold ambition, those 8 words hit harder than any statistic. J.D. Vance had the spotlight. AOC had a question no one rehearsed for. And when the video played, there were no talking points left to hide behind. No headline could soften what was already unfolding. This was not just a debate. It was a moment when truth didn't raise its voice. It simply walked into the room and refused to leave. What you're about to see is a dramatized retelling of that moment. The characters are real, the dialogue imagined. But the silence after her voice echoed through that chamber, that was real. And for millions watching, so was the lump in their throat. It was still early in Washington, the kind of hour when most people were just finishing breakfast. But Capitol Hill was already wide awake, humming with schedules, coffee cups, and quiet ambition. J.D. Vance arrived first. He moved like someone who knew exactly where the cameras were. His Navy suit was sharp but not flashy. His smile, practiced but not too polished. A reporter called his name, and he turned like it had been choreographed. "Senator, big hearing today. Nervous?" He laughed gently. "No nerves. Today we set the tone." The journalists loved that. It sounded confident, certain, and maybe that's what the country needed right now. Someone who spoke like they already knew the answer. Just around the corner, down a quieter hallway, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked at a slower pace. No reporters followed her, no flashing bulbs, just the soft sound of her steps and the rustle of papers inside a slim leather folder. She wasn't here to perform. Her eyes weren't scanning for attention. They were scanning for truth. Her aide, a young woman with kind eyes and tension in her shoulders, leaned in. "He's going to open with numbers. Paint the border as chaos." AOC nodded, lips pressed together. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. They walked past a janitor mopping the floor. AOC paused, smiled, and said thank you. Not loudly, not for show, just because she meant it. In a different hallway, J.D. Vance was shaking hands with a retired sheriff from Ohio. Cameras clicked. His team had made sure they'd be there. Both were preparing. J.D. with charts, rehearsed lines, and the expectation of headlines. AOC with silence, a folder, and a name written on a tiny USB drive tucked into her pocket. Camilla. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even her full staff. Just the aide beside her, who had asked quietly that morning, "Are you sure you want to use it?" AOC had looked at her and said, "Not unless he gives me a reason." The air was changing, slowly, subtly. J.D. Vance passed her in the hallway. For a second, their eyes met. He nodded like a man sizing up an opponent. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She just walked on. "Wants headlines," her aide murmured. "Let him," AOC replied softly. No tension, no urgency, just calm. But calm has power too, especially when it's the kind that holds something back. Something that's waiting. No one watching the Capitol that morning, no aide, no intern, no anchor rehearsing their voiceovers, had any idea that a few hours later, a video would play inside that very building. A simple video, shaky, low quality, but real. And in that video, a little girl with tired eyes would ask a question no policy could explain. AOC didn't come to win today. She came to ask the one thing no one was ready to hear. And J.D. Vance? He had no idea that silence, not applause, would decide the story they'd all remember. The prep rooms just off the hearing chamber were nothing special. Fluorescent lighting, water bottles lined neatly along the edge of a long table, and folders stacked with care as if order itself could win a debate. But for J.D. Vance, this space was more than functional. It was familiar. He stood by the mirror adjusting his cuff, reciting lines he'd repeated so many times they barely sounded like words anymore. Make it about safety. Anchor everything in order. If they challenge compassion, redirect to control. He turned to his aide. Start soft, climb steady, land hard. The aide nodded, taking notes like a student before an exam. There was a strategy here, and JD was proud of it. He wasn't here to shout. He was here to sound reasonable, predictable, strong. He believed that if he could keep the debate on his terms, facts, figures, policy points, the room would follow. A few doors down, the atmosphere was different. AOC sat quietly at a small table. The lights above her flickered slightly, but she didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, it didn't bother her. She was reviewing a set of handwritten notes, neither typed nor formatted. Just thoughts gathered over days, maybe weeks, scribbled in different colors of ink. Her aide stepped in without knocking, carrying a plain manila envelope. It came just now. No note, just this inside. Inside the envelope was a small USB drive, silver, slightly scratched, with a single word written in pen on a thin strip of tape, Camila. AOC looked at it for a long moment, not with surprise, more like recognition, as if something had quietly arrived that she'd already been expecting. She didn't ask where it came from, didn't ask who sent it. She just nodded and placed it carefully beside her notes. A staffer watching from the doorway shifted, arms crossed. Are we using that? Her aide didn't respond right away. She looked at AOC instead. AOC didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. And that silence, gentle but steady, was answer enough. The team fell quiet. Not out of fear, but out of something else. Something harder to name. They trusted her judgment, but they also knew that what was on that drive might not just disrupt the room. It might change the entire tone of the hearing. In a corner of the room, someone had left the TV on mute. Footage of J.D. Vance entering the building looped again. He was smiling, waving, leaning in just enough to seem humble. AOC watched for a second, then turned back to her notes. Not to revise, just to remember. She said softly, to no one in particular, "They think this is about who argues best." The words hung there, not dramatic, not sharp, just present. Her aide broke the silence. "And if he doesn't give you an opening?" AOC met her eyes, warm but clear. "Then I'll listen. But if he does—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Down the hall, JD was rehearsing how to control the narrative. In this room, no one was rehearsing anything. They were waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the wrong sentence. Waiting for the silence that always comes when someone says something no one knows how to answer. And tucked into a folder beside a cup of now-cold tea, the USB sat quietly. Not a weapon, not a headline. Just a voice waiting to be heard. The gavel fell with its usual hollow knock, sharp enough to quiet a room, not loud enough to still it. Chairs shifted, papers rustled, a few phones were slipped face down onto the long mahogany table. The hearing was officially in session. Senator J.D. Vance leaned forward, his hands folded, posture composed. His tone, firm, measured, rehearsed, carried a sense of certainty, the kind that doesn't invite interruption. "Let me be clear," he began, voice steady as he scanned the room. "America is not a sanctuary for chaos." There it was, the opening chord. A few of his colleagues nodded. Someone murmured, "Well said." The cameras captured his angle perfectly, face calm, hands motionless, body angled just enough to suggest both strength and control. He continued, layering his words with the weight of data. "We are a nation of laws, not loopholes. A country built on rules, not open borders. We cannot allow compassion to become complicity." The audience behind him, a curated blend of supporters, policy advisors, and press, gave a soft round of applause. Polite, but purposeful. It was just enough noise to signal that his message had landed. Just enough to remind everyone watching at home who had set the tone. Across the room, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat still. She didn't glance at the cameras, didn't whisper to her aide. She had no reaction to the applause, no shift in posture, no visible tension. Only her pen moved, slowly tracing the edge of her notepad, drawing a straight line that never broke. A few rows back, a commentator for a major network leaned toward her producer. "Vance is owning this," he whispered. "She hasn't said a word." Another analyst tweeted, "J.D. Vance commanding the floor this morning. Sharp, controlled, definitely leading the room." But AOC didn't come to lead the room. Not right away. She came to listen and wait. Because the truth doesn't always show up in the first 10 minutes. Sometimes it waits until the air gets too comfortable. Sometimes it lingers in the pauses between confident declarations. Vance moved to his next point. Speaking of rising threats and misguided leniency, the words were crafted to feel inevitable, like common sense in formal clothes. We are not heartless, he added carefully, but we must be clear-eyed. If we cannot defend our borders, we cannot defend our values. AOC's eyes flicked toward the small digital clock above the clerk's desk. Still early, still on schedule. She took another breath, steady and quiet, as if measuring the room's rhythm, not its noise. To many watching, she seemed disengaged, passive. One commentator described her expression as neutral, perhaps indifferent, but those who knew her well understood better. This was how she worked, by observing what others rushed to claim, by letting the story unfold just enough before she placed her finger on the page and asked the one question that would make the rest of it stop making sense. As the chairman thanked J.D. Vance for his opening remarks, he looked to her side of the aisle. A few eyes turned with him, some curious, some dismissive. She didn't speak, not yet. She just reached for her glass of water. No rush, no reaction, just stillness in the face of motion. And somewhere inside the pocket of her coat, the USB marked Camilla remained untouched. For now. But every second she stayed silent was not a pause. It was a decision. Because sometimes letting someone build the stage is the only way to make sure their words collapse on it. The screen behind J.D. Vance flickered to life, filling the room with tall, color-coded bars and bold percentages. The kind of graphics designed not just to inform, but to impress. They stretched across the screen like certainties, clean, unambiguous, and hard to ignore. Let's begin with numbers, he said, pointing calmly to the first slide. This is where clarity lives. He spoke like a man reading facts from stone. No hesitation, no room for questions. Just border arrests over time, deportation rates, recidivism curves, all lined up in neat columns, as if people could be measured like rainfall. From 2021 to 2023, border apprehensions rose by 37%, he said, tapping the graph. Of those, nearly 12% were repeat crossers, and of that group, nearly a quarter had prior criminal records. He paused, not for breath, but to let the weight of it settle. Then he turned to the room. Compassion without control, he said slowly, is cruelty. The words landed exactly as he'd planned them to. A few heads nodded, not just on his side of the aisle. One senator scribbled something in her binder, perhaps the line itself. Aoc'S didn't move, not even her pen. Outside the chamber, cable news anchors were already quoting him. The chyron on one screen read, Vance, control is compassion. On another, Senator Vance cites new data to justify firm border stance. He clicked to the next slide. This chart shows the projected cost of housing undocumented minors in federal facilities. Over $3 billion annually. That's more than the entire budget for rural emergency response in some states. He let the room absorb that too. They call this care, he continued, but when we fail to enforce the line, we ask working families to carry the cost. And we pretend we're being humane. That's not policy, that's performance. It was clever in a way. The argument was tight, packaged neatly. No visible emotion, just language that sounded responsible, reasonable. Words made of stone dressed in soft cloth. But Aoc's knew something else. She knew how easily numbers could distance us, how a graph could flatten someone's pain into a data point, how people's names became intake rates, how stories disappeared under columns of cost. She had seen it before. She once sat with a woman who didn't speak English and held a photograph instead of paperwork. That woman didn't know the number they gave her daughter, only her nickname, only the way she always slept with one arm over her head, like she was blocking the sun. No graph had ever shown that, and now J.D. Vance stood with his charts, confident, sure, the room leaning toward him, and Aoc's just sat there watching, still, not because she had no answer, but because the more he spoke, the clearer it became. He was showing the room what he thought mattered, what could be counted, what could be priced, what could be erased by scale, and she was taking note of every omission. Because somewhere beneath all those lines and percentages was a single name, one that didn't fit neatly on a slide. And tucked inside her folder, the USB with that name still waited, quiet and unopened. For now, she let him speak, let him draw his maps, build his wall of numbers, reinforce his message. Because she understood something he didn't. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's just the sound of someone choosing the exact moment when the truth will no longer wait. The chart behind J.D. Vance glowed in confident blues and reds. Numbers stacked neatly, percentages placed just so. It was the kind of graphic designed to quiet a room with authority. And for a while it worked. Senators nodded, brows furrowed in pre-calculated concern. A few aides typed quotes into live tweet drafts. Somewhere in the gallery someone murmured, "He's got this locked." Then a pause. J.D. turned back toward the room, ready to continue, when a voice, calm, steady, and softer than the tone he'd been using, rose from the other side of the table. "Senator," Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, not raising her voice, not leaning forward, just speaking like someone who wasn't trying to win, only trying to be heard. "Your chart says 94,000 apprehensions. Can I ask, how many of those were children under 10? The question floated gently at first, but it didn't land that way. J.D. blinked. His mouth opened slightly, closed again, then tried to recover. The chart doesn't specify that breakdown." She nodded. "So it includes everyone?" He cleared his throat. "Yes, family units, individuals, total crossings." A longer silence followed, one not filled with papers shuffling or coffee cups shifting. Just stillness. AOC looked back at the screen, then turned to face him, but her voice didn't change. It stayed level, even kind. "I'm not against charts, but that one shows movement, not meaning. You counted people, but not who they were." He didn't reply. There wasn't a line in his prep for this. She continued, still soft but without backing down. "You made charts for Senator, not portraits." And just like that, something in the room shifted. Not dramatically, no gasps, no fiery retorts. Just the air thinning slightly, the way it does when something obvious is finally said aloud. From a few seats down, a staffer looked up from his laptop, eyes narrowed. In the gallery, someone stopped writing mid-sentence. A reporter mouthed silently to her colleague, "Write that down." J.D. adjusted his papers, searching for a foothold. We had limited time with the data, and the aim here is to understand the broader." She didn't press. She didn't need to. She had already drawn the line. Because in that moment, it wasn't about arguing. It was about reminding the room what it had forgotten to see. The number 94,000 had seemed powerful when it was bolded on a screen. But now it carried weight it wasn't built to hold. It had a face now, a height, a missing tooth, maybe a favorite color. And once that image entered the room, the mass started to feel smaller. J.D. moved on to his next slide a bit faster this time. He talked about budget projections and fiscal impact. His voice steadied, but his momentum didn't return the same way. Something had cracked, quietly but permanently. And AOC, she leaned back slightly, jotting something in the margin of her folder. Not triumphant, not satisfied, just present. Because sometimes the most disruptive thing you can do in a room full of performance is tell a truth so human it makes people stop performing. She hadn't come to counter everything, just the things that needed a pause, and this was one of them. She had arrived early, even though her seat wasn't reserved. She didn't carry a press badge or a staff credential. No one had invited her, but no one had stopped her either. She sat in the very last row of the hearing room, where the seats are narrower and the air feels a little farther from power. Her coat was folded neatly over her lap, her hands resting atop it, fingers lightly intertwined. Still, but not relaxed. Her name was Marisol, 26 years old, born in Michoacan, raised in El Paso. She was a DACA recipient, deferred action they called it. But most days it just felt like deferred belonging. No one noticed her as the hearing began. Why would they? She didn't speak. She didn't record. She didn't react when J.D. Vance's voice filled the chamber with charts and control. But when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asked that one question, how many were children under 10? Marisol's breath caught just for a second, not enough for anyone to hear, just enough for her to feel. She knew that number didn't exist in the spreadsheet because she used to be that number. A small child crossing a border with no words for fear, just the instinct to hold on tightly to her mother's hand. Now, all these years later, she sat in a room where her story was still invisible. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. AOC hadn't looked at her yet, not directly, but there was a moment, just after the exchange with J.D. Vance, when their eyes almost met. Almost. And in that moment, AOC's gaze drifted, not upward to the cameras, not downward to her notes, but sideways to the corner of her folder where a small USB sat tucked beneath a paperclip. Her fingers brushed it lightly, as if checking to make sure it was still there. Then slowly she picked up her pen and scribbled something in the margin of her page. 2 words, not yet. The words weren't dramatic, they weren't underlined, but they carried weight. They meant that something wasn't ready to be said, or maybe that the room wasn't ready to hear it. Marisol didn't know what was on the USB, but she knew what waiting looked like, what holding something too big for the room felt like, and she recognized the expression AOC wore, one that said, "I've carried this long enough. When the time is right, I won't carry it alone." Around her, the room continued. Senators murmured to each other. Staffers scribbled furiously. Someone stifled a yawn. But Marisol sat still, her hands now resting gently over her coat, as if protecting something fragile. The woman next to her shifted, unaware of who she was sitting beside. J.D. Vance gestured toward a new chart. The chairman adjusted his glasses and glanced at the clock. But AOC was no longer watching the screen. She was watching the silence. Because sometimes it's not the loudest moment that tells you a room is changing. It's the moment when someone in the very back stops holding their breath. And when someone at the front writes quietly, "Not yet," not as hesitation, but as a promise. The hearing had settled into its rhythm, presentations followed by polite nods, questions wrapped in political courtesy, replies crafted to avoid risk. J.D. Vance had returned to his central theme: security, sovereignty, and systems of control. He spoke confidently, even comfortably, as if each line had been spoken so many times it no longer needed thought. "We must be honest about the reality at the border," he said, clicking to another chart. "This isn't just about feelings. It's about protecting our future." He didn't notice that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had stopped writing. She looked up, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet stillness that asked the room to pay attention, without needing to say so. She waited for a moment of breath between his words, and then spoke, not to challenge, but to invite something deeper. "Senator Vance," she said gently, "have you ever sat with a 6-year-old child in a detention facility?" There was no edge in her voice, no accusation. It wasn't a performance. It was a question, a real one. And maybe that's what made it so difficult. J.D. looked momentarily caught off guard, just a flicker, but it passed quickly. He gave a short, dry laugh and shook his head. "This isn't a therapy session, Congresswoman," he replied, waving a hand toward the charts. "We're here to talk about real policy, not stories meant to stir emotions." A few people chuckled nervously, unsure if they were meant to. But AOC didn't smile. She didn't break eye contact. She simply answered as calmly as she'd asked. "No," she said softly. "It's about who gets to feel safe and who doesn't." The air changed. No one moved right away. The hum of shuffling papers had stopped. Even the senator to JD's left looked down at his notes, uncertain of what to do with his hands. JD blinked and leaned back, clearly preparing to respond. But for a moment the words didn't come. Because it wasn't just the question, it was the way she asked it, like someone who already knew the answer. Like someone who had been in that room, held that child's hand, listened to the silence between sobs when a child no longer asked where their mother went, because they had already figured it out. AOC didn't raise her voice. She didn't speak over anyone. But somehow her words sat heavier than anything that had come before. A reporter in the back row whispered to her colleague, "That wasn't in the talking points." The colleague just nodded, typing the question word for word into their live blog. Have you ever sat with a 6-year-old in a detention facility? No one clapped, no one interrupted, but something had shifted. J.D. Vance still sat at the head of his data, still had more slides to present, still had allies on the committee, but now his arguments sounded like they came from somewhere further away, from a script that didn't know this part was coming. And AOC? She didn't look triumphant. She didn't lean in or push further. She simply let the question hang, gently but firmly, in the space between them. Because there are moments in public life when the most powerful thing you can do is ask the one question the room wasn't prepared to answer. And in that quiet, in that space where rebuttal suddenly feels small, the truth has a way of making itself known, not with force, but with presence. For a few seconds after the question, the hearing room held its breath. J.D. Vance cleared his throat, flipping through his notes as if a well-placed number might bring back control. But the shift had already happened. Not loud, not abrupt, but steady. Like the current of a slow-moving river that suddenly changes direction. AOC didn't press the silence. She simply opened the folder in front of her, with care, not urgency. She reached inside and pulled out the small silver USB. It was ordinary in appearance. No label, no color, just a strip of worn tape on one side with a single word handwritten in faded black ink. Camilla. She turned slightly toward the committee clerk, a young man in a navy tie who blinked twice before realizing she was addressing him. "Mr. Chair," she said, voice calm, almost conversational. "With your permission, I'd like to submit a short video into the record. I believe it offers a voice we've been missing from this conversation." There was no edge in her tone, no grand gesture. She didn't raise the USB or call for drama. She simply stated it, as if sharing a truth was the most natural next step. The chairman looked up, caught off guard. He glanced toward J.D. Vance, who was still flipping a page he'd already looked at twice. There was a brief pause, the kind that usually signals behind-the-scenes negotiation, but in this case there was none. Only the weight of a voice asking to be heard. The chairman gave a slow nod. "Proceed." The clerk stepped forward, hands slightly unsure. AOC passed him the USB gently, their fingers not quite touching. And just like that, something shifted again. J.D. Vance sat straighter. His jaw tightened. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked not composed but cautious. His aides exchanged glances behind him. One leaned slightly toward the other, whispering, "What's on that drive?" No one seemed to know. AOC sat back, folding her hands in her lap. Her eyes didn't leave the screen as the clerk connected the drive. No explanation, no setup. She didn't frame what was about to play. She didn't need to. The room dimmed just slightly as the screen lit up. In the gallery, reporters leaned forward. Phones hovered. Fingers paused over record buttons. Staffers stopped typing. A still image blinked into view. A bare room, a metal folding chair, a child, maybe 6 years old, seated across from someone whose face we couldn't see. The child's hair was messy, eyes wide but dull, like someone who had run out of questions too soon. There was no music, no narration, just the faint hum of a ceiling vent and the child's breathing. The pause before the video began felt longer than it was, and in that moment, before a single word had been spoken, the hearing no longer felt like policy. It felt like something else entirely, like the moment just before a door opens, like the quiet right before someone tells you something they've never said out loud. AOC didn't look at Vance. She didn't look at the room. She just watched the screen, hands still, breath steady. Because sometimes entering evidence doesn't mean proving a point. It means making space for a truth that hasn't had one. The image was simple. No captions, no logos. Just a child sitting on a folding chair that seemed far too large for her. Her hair was unbrushed, sticking up on one side like she'd been lying on concrete. She wore a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big, sleeves gathered around her small fists. A quiet voice asked her something in Spanish. Off camera, gentle. The kind of voice adults use when they're trying not to scare someone who's already been scared too much. The girl didn't answer right away. She rubbed the hem of her sleeve between her fingers. Her legs didn't reach the floor. Then she spoke softly, so softly that at first the room leaned in just to hear it. "No sé qué hizo mi mamá." Pero creo que América la odia. A moment passed and the translation was added in subtitles at the bottom of the screen. Not automated, not stylized, just typed plainly, as if someone didn't want the words to be lost. I don't know what my mom did, but I think America hates her. That was it. No build-up, no dramatic music, no screaming, just a sentence that landed like a quiet explosion. There was a small sound in the gallery, a sharp inhale, someone forgetting not to react. Another person lowered their eyes. A reporter stopped typing mid-keystroke. And across the room, J.D. Vance sat completely still. The camera, one of the feed monitors used for committee documentation, caught his expression. Just for a second. Not shocked, not angry, just unprepared. Like someone who had spent days preparing for a speech, but not for this. AOC didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She just sat there, hands folded gently, her gaze steady on the screen. No emotion flashed across her face. No movement of the shoulders, no satisfaction. Only presence. Only space. Because this wasn't about the politics anymore. Not in this moment. This wasn't about who had the sharper quote or the bigger chart. This was about a child's voice, recorded in a side room of a holding center, somewhere along a stretch of desert most Americans would never see. A voice that had asked a question no one in that room had prepared to answer. Not even AOC. That's why she let the silence stay. She didn't try to explain it. She didn't add commentary, because there are some moments when even clarity feels like intrusion. A man in the second row shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat as if that might break the tension. But no one followed him. Not yet. Not while the sentence still echoed in their minds. But I think America hates her. A sentence that didn't accuse. It only wondered. And in that wondering, it asked everyone in the room something uncomfortable. What have we made this country feel like to a child? For all the talk about systems and strategy, about sovereignty and security, none of it felt as permanent as that voice. None of it lingered the way that simple question did. When the video ended, the screen returned to black. Still, AOC didn't speak. She didn't need to. Sometimes silence does more than words ever could. It makes people sit with what they've just seen. It makes them feel what they'd rather calculate. And in that hearing room for the first time all morning, there was no debating, no summarizing, no next slide. Only the weight of a truth too small to fight back, but too real to forget. No one spoke right away. Not because they didn't know what to say, most did, but because they weren't sure how to return to the kind of words they'd been using before. J.D. Vance sat upright, adjusting his cuff in a motion that felt more like habit than control. He cleared his throat once, then again, and when he spoke, his voice was firm, but something in the room had shifted. It was harder to command attention now, harder to sound decisive when everyone was still thinking about a child's voice, wondering why she wasn't welcome. We have a responsibility, he began, choosing his words carefully, to protect this country, to maintain order. We must lead with law, not tears. He didn't look at AOC when he said it. He looked past her toward the committee chair, toward the press, toward the structure of things, the architecture of debate that he understood. And to his credit, there was a logic in his words, but it was the kind of logic that only worked when feelings hadn't already entered the room. AOC didn't respond right away. She didn't interrupt. She let the pause remain a little longer than was comfortable. She watched the space his sentence left behind. Not just the words, but the space. Then she leaned forward, just slightly, and spoke in a voice so soft the microphones barely caught it. Law without heart, she said, is machinery. And machinery breaks. Her tone didn't accuse. It didn't escalate. It didn't challenge. It simply offered a truth, quietly, plainly, and let it settle. Across the room, a staffer's hand froze above their keyboard. Another, sitting closer to the wall, was already pulling out their phone. Not to scroll, but to record. The sentence didn't shout, but it echoed. First inside the hearing, then outside. The words spread not like fire, but like a deep breath people didn't know they needed. They moved through screens into clips, into captions. AOC hadn't raised her voice, but she had said something people were still holding in their chest when they replayed the video hours later. A journalist whispered to her colleague, "That's going to be the line." the colleague replied without lifting their eyes. It already is. J.D. Vance shifted in his seat, trying not to show he'd noticed. He returned to his papers, but they no longer felt like ground beneath his feet. He still had points to make, data to recite, but it no longer felt like the room was asking for more. It felt like the room was still listening to what had already been said, because something had cracked open, not through confrontation, but through contrast. He had spoken of order. She had spoken of meaning. He had referenced law. She had reminded them of loss. And now every sentence he spoke afterward sounded a little more mechanical. Not wrong exactly, but hollow in places he couldn't patch. AOC didn't follow up. She didn't press further. She just went quiet again, allowing her words to breathe, allowing the moment to remain a moment instead of rushing it into argument. Because when something true has finally been said out loud, the most respectful thing you can do is let it linger. It started quietly, the way some storms do. One clip, 30 seconds long. AOC, sitting still as a little girl on screen, asked why America hated her. The video didn't need edits or music. It didn't need context. It already had everything. A child, a question, and a room too stunned to answer. Within an hour, the clip had made its way onto Twitter. Someone had pulled the moment straight from the hearing livestream. The caption was simple: "This just broke me." Hashtag, why does America hate her? By the time it reached 10,000 retweets, the hashtag had already begun trending. People didn't argue. They shared. A nurse from Arizona wrote, "I work with kids like her. They never cry loudly. That's how you know they've given up." A retired teacher from Georgia added, "I spent 32 years teaching children how to ask questions. Now I wonder if we've spent enough time listening to them." A veteran posted, "I didn't serve for charts. I served so kids like her wouldn't be afraid of our flag." TikTok took the moment in a different direction. Young creators duetted the clip with tears in their eyes, overlaying the child's voice with their own reflections. Some read poetry. Some sat in silence. Some simply asked, "What are we doing?" The sound of the child's voice became a refrain, soft, barely above a whisper, looping on videos that were now being viewed by millions. "I don't know what my mom did, but I think America hates her." At Fox News, anchors tried to pivot, but even they didn't seem sure how to continue. One paused mid-sentence before moving to the next story. Another tried to frame it as emotional manipulation, but their co-host didn't nod like usual. Instead, she just stared at the desk, lips pressed tightly together. On CNN, the moment was labeled something else entirely: a moral earthquake on Capitol Hill. Even the language had changed. No longer a hearing, it was now the moment. Not Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's remarks, just her silence after the child spoke. Editorials came quickly. The New York Times ran the headline, "The Sentence That Froze the Room." The Atlantic published a short column titled, "When a Child Said What Congress Couldn't." And even Politico, usually more clinical, described the clip as the emotional rupture Washington didn't see coming. In inboxes across the country, the clip showed up in forwarded emails from grandparents to grandchildren, and from one school teacher to another. Some messages were just a single sentence: "You need to see this." By mid-afternoon, the Capitol press pool was buzzing, not about legislation, but about the moment. J.D. Vance's aides worked to circulate talking points, but they were already too late. The story had moved on. The narrative had already taken shape, and it didn't center him. Inside AOC's office, staffers sat quietly, watching it all unfold. No one cheered. No one claimed victory. They knew what the child had said wasn't a soundbite. It was a mirror. And sometimes when a mirror is held up to a nation, the loudest thing you can do is let people see themselves. The next morning, the mailroom at the Capitol was quieter than usual, but something had changed. Not in volume, but in texture. The usual policy packets and donor envelopes were there, of course, but interspersed between them were things far less polished. Handwritten letters, pages torn from notebooks, envelopes addressed in trembling cursive, some without return addresses at all. By mid-morning, AOC's staff had a growing stack on her desk. Some had been mailed overnight, dropped in local post offices the moment the hearing ended. Others were hand-delivered by veterans, teachers, janitors, people who usually walk past congressional offices without ever thinking to stop. No one told them to write. No one organized a campaign. They simply felt something and needed to say it out loud. A staffer opened the first one slowly, almost cautiously. It began with no greeting, just a line written in uneven handwriting. "I voted against you, but I cried last night. You were right." Another letter read, "That child's voice reminded me of my granddaughter. Her tone, her confusion. I haven't stopped thinking about it." A man from Ohio wrote, "I don't usually write Democrats, but silence like that? You honored it. Thank you." A teacher in Kansas sent a copy of a student's drawing. Crayon figures, one tall, one small, holding hands beside a chain-link fence. On top, the child had scrawled in bright orange, "Let her be with her mom." AOC sat at her desk, reading them one by one. Not scanning, but truly reading, turning the paper carefully as if it might crumble if handled too quickly. Her staff moved quietly around her, understanding without needing to be told that this wasn't the time for schedules or strategy. There was something unspoken in the way she held each letter. A kind of reverence, not for the praise, but for the risk each writer took in reaching out. Because these weren't political allies. These weren't preachers to the choir. They were people who had, in one form or another, told themselves for years that compassion belonged in homes, not in hearings. That law had no place for softness, that the border was an idea, not a place where children sat quietly wondering why their mothers had disappeared. But now they were writing to her, not because she had convinced them with argument, but because she had let them hear a voice no one else had offered. She didn't read aloud. She didn't post any on social media. She just held them, page after page, absorbing not just the words but the shift they represented. J.D. Vance, meanwhile, had canceled his afternoon appearance on a major political talk show. His staff said he had scheduling conflicts, but reporters noticed he had no events listed that day. His spokesperson issued a statement about policy clarity, but it was buried under headlines quoting the little girl's voice and AOC's reply. In offices up and down the hill, aides whispered about the moment, not just the video, but the silence that followed. That silence had spoken in a language more people understood than anyone had expected. Back in her office, AOC picked up one last letter before turning off the desk lamp. This one was written in pencil, block letters, signed simply M. It read, "You didn't raise your voice, but you helped me hear something I'd been ignoring, and now I can't unhear it." She closed the envelope gently, set it aside, and let the quiet settle around her. Not as absence, but as confirmation. The hearing had moved on. The official agenda was back in place. More data, more statements, more carefully measured words. But something beneath it had shifted. You could feel it in the way people paused before speaking now, in how some pages turned slower, in how even the air seemed to carry a quieter tension. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez waited until a lull, not dramatic, not planned, just a moment when the room's attention had begun to scatter. That's when she leaned forward, her voice as even and steady as ever. "I want to speak briefly, not in opposition, but in memory." The room didn't silence itself, but it softened. Even J.D. Vance, though he didn't look directly at her, seemed to sit still. "The girl in the video, her name is Camilla." She let the name rest there for a moment. No explanation yet, no context, just the name. It was enough to change the feel of the room. "She's 6 years old," AOC continued gently. "Her mother, Rosa, fled Honduras after refusing to pay protection money to a local gang. They threatened her twice. The third time, they came to her home." The murmurs stopped. Rosa carried Camilla through the desert, holding her at night when she had no blankets, sharing her water when it ran low. They made it to the border. But Rosa didn't have papers. She didn't have a lawyer. She had a child in fear and hope, and that wasn't enough. AOC didn't raise her voice. She didn't push. She was arrested. Camilla was separated from her 3 days later. No explanation, just taken. Her words were slow, deliberate, not because she was unsure, but because she knew every sentence carried more than meaning. It carried memory. She was held in a privately run facility for 14 months. No charges, no hearing, just held. A senator across the aisle shifted in his chair. Another looked down at her lap, suddenly still. Camilla hasn't seen her mother in 421 days. There was no gasp this time, no outburst, just stillness. She doesn't know why, AOC added. She thinks maybe her mom did something wrong. Maybe she talked back, or didn't run fast enough. Or maybe, and this part is hard, maybe her mom didn't love her anymore. Her voice trembled just slightly, not with weakness, but with weight. She didn't pause for effect. She paused because it was human to do so. Children fill in the gaps when adults leave silence. And what they fill it with, she said, is often much harder to undo than any policy. She didn't hold up papers, didn't quote from a bill. She simply let the story speak for itself. I'm not asking for sympathy, she continued. I'm asking that we remember, behind every policy, there is someone small enough to disappear inside it. The chairman looked down, fidgeting with a pen. No one interrupted her, not even those who disagreed with her politics, because this wasn't politics. Not here, not in this part. AOC folded her notes slowly, with care. She's not a number, not a case file, not a moment of viral empathy. She looked toward the back of the room, as if speaking to someone not present, or maybe someone who'd always been present, just never invited to speak. Her name was Camila, she said again softly, and she is still waiting. And then she said nothing else, because some truths don't need to be followed. They just need to be heard. It didn't take long. These things never do anymore. By late evening, the clip of Camilla's voice had already traveled farther than anyone expected. But by morning, the story began to split into two. One path led to the child who asked a country to remember her, the other to the man who couldn't answer her. An old video surfaced, grainy but clear enough. J.D. Vance, speaking at a private donor forum 2 years earlier. He stood at a polished wooden podium, sleeves rolled up, laughing slightly as he delivered the line. We've let emotional politics run wild. Tears don't build policy. Borders don't need bedtime stories. The audience laughed, back then anyway. It had seemed clever in the moment, but now the clip was being reposted side by side with Camilla's video. His line, her face, his smirk, her quiet voice. It was no longer clever. It was cold. The edits didn't add music or commentary. They didn't need to. The contrast did all the work. On one side of the screen, a child whispering, "I think America hates her." On the other, a senator dismissing those emotions as weakness. It spread fast. A community pastor from Michigan posted it with a single line. There's nothing more dangerous than power that forgets how to feel. A Catholic advocacy group that had supported Vance's early campaigns issued a statement. Children are not rhetorical inconveniences. They are sacred. The shift was subtle at first. A few friendly outlets hesitated to repost his follow-up statements. Some called for context, but others quietly moved on to different stories. Internally, his team knew the numbers before the media did. Polling in key districts dipped. Not drastically, but enough to notice. Enough to make phones ring. Enough for campaign donors to ask, "What's your plan to reframe this?" But there was no framing that could soften the juxtaposition. No staff memo could rewrite a child's face. Every attempt to redirect the narrative felt forced, out of step with the moment. JD went quiet. He canceled 2 interviews that week, citing scheduling conflicts. His spokespeople released a statement emphasizing his commitment to responsible compassion, but no one quoted it. The moment had passed. The message didn't land, because the room wasn't asking for control anymore. It was asking for care. Meanwhile, AOC didn't issue any new comments. She didn't post the clip. She didn't respond to headlines. She let the public do the talking this time. In her office, someone had printed the image of the video edit, the one where his face and Camilla's were placed side by side. It wasn't posted, just pinned softly inside a folder, like a note someone didn't want to forget. Her staff moved through the day with quiet focus. There were calls, yes, and requests for interviews, but no one rushed. The moment had already said what needed to be said. The rest would unfold as it needed to. Because in politics, memory is often short, But emotion? Emotion lingers. It finds its way into kitchens, Sunday sermons, after-school carpools. It doesn't need permission to stay. And this time, J.D. Vance wasn't losing ground because he'd said something wrong. He was losing it because someone else had said something true. And now too many people had heard it. The hearing had ended hours ago, but the hallway outside the chamber still buzzed. Reporters lined both sides of the corridor, cameras lifted just slightly above eye level, ready to catch a soundbite. The questions came quickly, layered over one another. Congresswoman, do you believe the video changed public opinion? Was that moment planned? Any comment on Senator Vance's reaction? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez kept walking. Not brusquely, not dismissively, just with a calm that didn't need to compete with noise. She didn't slow for the cameras or turn toward the microphones. Her hand hovered near her side, fingers lightly brushing the folder tucked beneath her arm. A few steps later, a reporter called out one last question, this one quieter, more sincere. What should the country take away from what happened yesterday? Aoc'S paused briefly. She didn't turn fully around, just enough for her voice to carry gently. This wasn't about me. Then she kept walking. No podium, no headline. Just a sentence left behind like a light someone forgets to turn off. Quiet, but still shining. Back in her office, the air was still. Aides moved with quiet purpose. The phones had finally stopped ringing. The inbox still filled with messages, but no one rushed to answer them. The moment had moved beyond response. Now it was about how to carry it. Aoc'S stepped into the small conference room tucked behind her workspace. The walls were simple, the table modest. But on one side of the room, just above a row of stacked bookshelves, was something more personal. A collage of names, pinned one by one. They weren't campaign slogans or case numbers. They were handwritten on small white cards, each with a single name, and beneath it, the briefest of notes. A date, a circumstance, a memory. Ruth, eviction notice, Bronx, 2020. Elias, detained at the border, age 9. Maria, died waiting for insulin shipment. It wasn't curated for the public. No one outside the office ever saw it. This wasn't about press strategy or political messaging. It was about remembering. Aoc'S stood quietly before the wall, the folder still under her arm. Slowly, she reached into it and pulled out a blank card. She uncapped a pen, one that had nearly run out of ink but still worked if you pressed just firmly enough. She wrote simply, Camilla, age 6'4", 121 days and counting. She pinned it gently between two others, adjusting it slightly to make sure it was even. Then she stepped back, folded her arms loosely and just looked. Not with pride, not with grief, with vigilance. Because there is a weight that comes with carrying stories that don't belong to you, but still need someone to carry them. It's not a victory. It's not a burden. It's something else. A kind of quiet power that doesn't shout, but stays. And in that room, with no applause, no press, and no one watching but her staff behind the glass, Aoc'S did what she always did after moments like these. She listened to the silence. Because sometimes the deepest kind of strength isn't in how loudly you speak after something has changed. It's in how deeply you're willing to remember it. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of the wind tapping gently against the back door. Outside, the fields were half frozen, a pale wash of winter light just beginning to slip across the snow-covered ground. The coffee in the pot had long gone lukewarm, and the toast on the plate was untouched. Elaine sat at the kitchen table in her house just outside Madison, Wisconsin, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, even though she wasn't drinking from it. In front of her sat a tablet, one her grandson had given her. In case you want to video chat, Grandma, though she rarely used it for more than the weather or family photos. But that morning, something different had caught her attention. The hearing. She hadn't meant to watch the whole thing. It started with a clip that showed up on her feed. A little girl's voice, soft and unsure, asking why America hated her mother. Elaine had clicked on it without thinking, and then she hadn't moved. Now the full video played quietly in her lap, and she sat alone, watching. She wasn't a woman easily shaken. She had lived through recessions, wars, and the slow erosion of faith in the institutions she was raised to trust. Her husband had been a factory worker, her daughter a nurse. She had voted across party lines more than once, but politics rarely made her cry, until now. Her hand trembled as she reached for a tissue, dabbing her eyes with more embarrassment than sadness, though both were there. She looked away from the screen for a moment, letting her gaze rest on the faded placemat beneath her coffee mug, the one her granddaughter had made in third grade, with glitter glue and misspelled words. And then she picked up the phone. She didn't scroll through contacts. She dialed from memory, just like she used to. "Hi, Grandma." The voice on the other end was tired but warm. "Thomas," she said quietly, "do you have a minute?" Her grandson was a Marine, deployed twice, now back home, trying to figure out what came next. He knew his grandmother didn't usually call without a reason. "Sure. Everything okay?" She hesitated. "I just watched something. A hearing? Congress? AOC was there." He chuckled softly. "You're watching congressional hearings now?" "I didn't mean to," she said. "But there was this girl, a little girl in a video. She was in a detention center, maybe 6 years old. Her voice, Thomas, she didn't sound angry. She just sounded lost." He went quiet on the line. "She said," Elaine continued, voice catching, "she said, 'I think America hates my mom.'" Thomas exhaled. "Yeah, I saw it too. Someone sent me the clip." Elaine wiped her cheek again. "I don't know what I thought we were doing, but this is what service is supposed to mean, isn't it? Protecting children like her?" He didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he said finally. "That's what it's supposed to mean." They sat in silence for a few seconds, neither quite knowing what to say next. Then Elaine added softly, "I used to think strength was about not crying, but today I'm not so sure." Thomas smiled, not that she could see it. "You're allowed to cry, Grandma." "Well, I did," she said, almost laughing now. "And I'm not sorry." She didn't talk about elections, or immigration, or policy. She didn't need to. What she had witnessed hadn't asked her to pick a side. It had asked her to feel something, and she had. After they hung up, she stayed at the table for a long while. The video had ended, but its words lingered in the air like the scent of old perfume, faint but present. She reached for a notepad and wrote one sentence down. "We forgot she was a child." Then she folded it in half, tucked it inside the envelope meant for her congressman, and sealed it shut. Because sometimes watching is no longer enough. Sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that ask us to speak. The Sunday morning news circuit was where reputations were mended, or broken. It had long been the ritual after a difficult week in Washington. Show up in a clean suit, speak in measured tones, steer the conversation back to policy, and hope America remembered numbers more than faces. J.D. Vance knew this routine. His staff had prepped him carefully. They'd rehearse the key messages, control the narrative, emphasize security, lean on polling. He had the talking points printed on crisp white cards, each word carefully chosen to sound firm, but fair. But nothing about the week had gone as expected. By the time he sat down across from the anchor on the national broadcast, the pressure was already humming underneath his smile. "Good morning, Senator," the anchor began. "Thanks for joining us." "Good to be here," J.D. replied, shifting slightly in his seat. The smile was practiced, but something in his eyes betrayed how tired he was. The first few questions were predictable. Border statistics, legislation, next steps. J.D. stuck to his script. "We must balance compassion with control," he said. "No one denies the human side of this, but we can't build immigration policy around individual stories." The anchor listened, nodding politely. Then, with the ease of someone who had done this hundreds of times, she leaned in and asked, "Senator, do you know where Camilla is now?" The question landed softly. There was no bite in her voice, no accusation. Just a pause in the air. J.D. blinked. "I—" He looked briefly off camera, then back. "I don't have the specifics in front of me, but I'm sure she's receiving the appropriate care through the proper channels." The anchor didn't flinch. "You've spoken a lot about systems this week, but you showed a strong reaction during the hearing. So again, where is she now?" J.D.'s voice tightened. "That's not really the focus here. The point is, our job is to manage the border responsibly." But the damage was done. His hesitation had been clipped, subtitled and uploaded before the segment even ended. By noon, the clip had gone viral under a new hashtag, whereas Camilla commentators didn't need to editorialize. They just let the silence play. The way his eyes drifted, the pause that lasted too long, the tone that changed when asked something human. Even sympathetic outlets struggled to defend the moment. A conservative radio host sighed on air. He should have known, or at least cared enough to find out. By afternoon, the clip had made it to late-night Twitter accounts and faith-based parenting groups. One post read, "If you don't know where she is, how can you say you're protecting her?" In campaign offices across the country, consultants began redlining his name from surrogate lists. One strategist muttered, "He can't be the face of border messaging right now." Inside JD's office, aides moved with quiet urgency. One kept refreshing polling numbers. Another drafted a statement that started with the words, "The senator deeply sympathizes with all affected families." But the draft was never released. They knew it wouldn't help, because this wasn't a policy error. It was a human one. And it didn't matter how tightly the messaging had been managed. What people saw was a man who spoke in frameworks, but went silent when asked about a child. AOC, for her part, said nothing. She didn't reference the segment. No tweets, no remarks, no victory lap. She didn't need one. The country had already seen the contrast. And in politics, as in life, people may forget the numbers. But they remember who paused when it was time to answer, and who didn't. It was a cloudy Saturday morning, the kind that made the city feel softer than usual. In the Bronx, near a row of weathered apartment buildings and corner bodegas still opening their gates, a small community library had already begun to fill with quiet energy. There were no cameras, no press, just folding chairs arranged in a half circle, a table with name tags and crayons for children, and a hand-lettered sign that read, "Know Your Rights, Immigration, Q&A, free and open to all." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat near the back of the room as families trickled in. Mothers carrying toddlers, fathers still in work boots, teens helping younger siblings find a seat. She greeted them with a smile, offering water bottles and simple words like, "Thanks for coming, and we'll take it slow today." It wasn't a rally, it wasn't a protest, it was something gentler. A translator sat near the front, ready to assist. A social worker from a nearby nonprofit had brought pamphlets. A local teacher handed out snacks. It felt less like politics and more like community. A place to breathe and ask questions that didn't always have answers, but at least deserved to be asked. The discussion was soft at first. One woman asked how to find a pro bono immigration attorney. Another asked what to do if an employer threatened to call ICE. A young man asked about the difference between asylum and refugee status. AOC responded with the kind of clarity that came not just from research, but from listening. But the moment that stayed didn't come from any adult. It came from a girl, maybe 10 years old, sitting cross-legged near the front. She had been quiet all morning, coloring the edges of her name tag, occasionally glancing at the adults with a mixture of curiosity and caution. When AOC opened the floor for final questions, the girl raised her hand slowly, as if unsure whether she was allowed. AOC noticed immediately. "Yes, sweetheart," she said gently. The girl sat up straighter. "The girl from the video," she began. "The one who said America hates her mom. Will they let her see her mom now?" The room stilled. No one looked at their phones. No one whispered. It was as if all the noise from outside, the trains, the horns, the city itself, had paused just long enough to make space for one question. AOC didn't answer right away. She stood, walked slowly toward the girl, then crouched beside her so their eyes met. Not from above, but at the same level. She placed a hand gently over her heart. "Not yet," she said softly, "but we made sure they heard her." The girl nodded, her mouth pressing into a quiet line. She didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. Around them, a few people wiped their eyes. A mother reached for her son's hand. A man who hadn't spoken all day cleared his throat and quietly said, "Gracias." AOC stayed there a moment longer, then smiled. "And we'll keep making sure they hear all of us," she added, still speaking to the girl, but loud enough for the room to hear. The event ended not with applause, but with conversation. Families lingering, swapping phone numbers, folding up chairs together. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself as a victory, but builds into something stronger over time. Trust. As she gathered her things, AOC slipped one of the coloring sheets into her folder. It wasn't complete, just the outline of a girl with a small sun above her head. In the corner, written in pencil, were the words, "I think she's brave." That night, AOC walked home with the drawing tucked beside her notes. No news cycle, no press release, just the memory of a child asking a question and the promise, however quiet, that she wouldn't have to ask it alone. In a modest high school classroom on the southern edge of Arizona, sunlight filtered softly through blinds that didn't quite close all the way. The desks were arranged in a loose horseshoe, and on the whiteboard was written in blue marker, "Civic Reflection. What does justice sound like?" It was a Tuesday morning, quiet, ordinary, nothing in the schedule that hinted anything world-changing was about to happen. But Ms. Ramirez, a government teacher who had spent 18 years in the same room, had added one line to the lesson plan. Watch congressional hearing clip, AOC in the USB. She'd debated showing it. The story was raw. The silence in the room had been heavier than usual since the video had gone viral. But something told her the students didn't just need information. They needed to see what it looked like when someone told the truth without raising their voice. The projector flickered to life. A hush fell over the room. Camilla's voice played, trembling but steady. "I don't know what my mom did, but I think America hates her." No music, no narration, just that sentence and the stillness that followed. Then AOC's expression, quiet, composed, almost protective, and the committee room frozen in its own discomfort. Some students shifted in their seats. Others leaned in. When the video ended, no one spoke right away. The silence wasn't awkward, it was processing. Finally, a boy named Jalen, usually the class clown, always ready with a joke, stood up. "She didn't yell," he said, eyes fixed on the floor, then back up at Miss Ramirez. "She just, didn't let go." Miss Ramirez nodded gently. "That's called strength," she said. "Not the kind we usually celebrate, but the kind that endures." A girl in the back, Emma, raised her hand. "Is Camilla okay now?" The teacher hesitated, then replied honestly, "We don't know yet, but now millions of people do know her name." That seemed to settle something in the room. The conversation turned. Students asked what Congress could actually do, what happens to kids in detention, how policies are written. It wasn't loud or fast. It moved like a creek after rain, steady, honest, going deeper than usual. Later, after the bell rang and students filed out in pairs, some more talkative than others, Ms. Ramirez found a folded note on her desk. No name, just a sentence. "My mom was scared too. Thank you for showing this." She didn't need to know who wrote it. That afternoon, she updated the class website. At the bottom of the reading list, she added a new section. Voices that weren't supposed to matter, but did. Camilla's name was the first entry. Across the country, in places where politics usually felt distant, something quieter was happening. A librarian in Michigan added the hearing clip to her media literacy workshop. A social studies teacher in Georgia paired it with a lesson on the Constitution. A group of college freshmen in Oregon asked their professor if dignity could be a political strategy. And in a few living rooms, parents sat beside their kids, not to explain what had happened, but to ask, "What did you feel?" Not "what did you think," but "feel," because somehow a child's question had reached past the usual noise, past party lines, past talking points. It wasn't just about Camilla anymore. It was about who gets remembered, who gets believed, and who, even when unseen, still changes the room. The clock on her desk read 12:03 a.m. The office was quiet except for the faint hum of a desk lamp and the soft clatter of her fingers tapping her water bottle. Once, then again. The hearing had ended 2 days ago, but the weight hadn't lifted. It rarely did. It just shifted. AOC leaned into her laptop and clicked go live. She didn't announce it. No graphics, no team. Just a grainy webcam, her in a sweater with her hair tied up loosely, and the walls of her office lined with handwritten letters, some taped, some pinned, some just resting. "Hi," she began with a half smile. "It's late, I know." The chat slowly came alive. First a few familiar names, then a stream of hearts, emojis, and quiet. "We're here." She looked down once, gathered her breath, then spoke. Not in debate mode, not even like a public figure. More like a neighbor who had seen too much and was still sorting through what it meant. "He had graphs," she said softly, "charts, talking points. He had phrases like due process and national security. And yes, those matter. I'm not here to mock any of it." She paused, but I had her voice. She didn't say Camilla's name right away. She didn't need to. Everyone watching knew. "I've sat through a lot of silence in that room," she continued. "Silence after bad questions. Silence when no one knows how to answer. But that silence, when she said those words, I think America hates her. It wasn't emptiness. It was presence. It was all the things we never ask, sitting right there between us." The comments started to pour in faster now. "That line gutted me." "I'm crying again." "We heard her too." She read them slowly, almost reverently, then looked back at the camera. "I wasn't trying to win anything. I just couldn't stop thinking about how many people sit in silence all the time, holding that same fear Camilla spoke. Not just immigrants. People in line at hospitals, people with eviction notices, people who speak quietly and are ignored because they don't sound like experts." She looked off screen for a moment, then back again, voice barely above a whisper. "I will never forget what silence did in that room." Then she smiled, small but sincere. "And I hope they never forget it either." The comments shifted, less political, more human. Some just said, "Thank you. You saw her. You asked what no one else would." AOC didn't stay live long. 20 minutes, maybe less. She answered one or two policy questions, but even then, gently, her voice didn't rise. Her words weren't designed to trend. They were designed to reach. Before logging off, she turned slightly in her chair and gestured to the wall behind her. "These stories," she said, tapping one folded piece of paper, "they're not here to decorate my office. They're reminders of who we fail when we move too fast, of who we forget when we only focus up here." She tapped her temple. "And not in here." She tapped her heart. Then she gave a small nod. "Thanks for staying up with me." She ended the stream. Somewhere across the country, in a college dorm, two roommates sat watching with tissues on their laps. One of them whispered, "That didn't feel like politics. That felt like church." In a retirement home in Florida, a former union organizer turned off the live stream and closed her eyes for a moment. Then, with a slow breath, she opened her email and began typing to her congressman for the first time in a decade. And in a detention center, though Camilla couldn't see the live stream, someone who knew her, another mother, another voice, whispered, "They're talking about her. She's not forgotten." The building had emptied. The hum of conversation, footsteps, and clipped schedules had faded into a still, padded quiet. In her office, AOC sat alone, a cup of tea untouched beside her, the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. The day had stretched long, but it wasn't the kind of fatigue that called for sleep. It was the kind that asked for reflection. On her desk was a photo, not a headline, not a chart, just Camilla, hair pulled back, hands folded, eyes steady in that moment from the hearing. AOC reached for the picture, not to study it, but to be still with it. Her thumb brushed lightly along the edge. In that hush, she whispered, "Not for cameras, not even for memory. Just a thought breathed into a room that had held so many." "They prepared for a debate," she murmured. "I came with a question." She didn't need to say more. The room, the letters on the wall, the quiet strength that had grown across the country, all of it already understood. She stood, walked to the corner where the light didn't fully reach, and pinned Camilla's photo beside the others. For a second, her hand lingered, pressing the corners gently, as if anchoring it not just to the wall, but to something deeper. Then she stepped back, not to admire, but to remember. On screen, a final line appeared, simple, weightless, and true. She didn't interrupt. She interrupted history. And the screen faded to black. No music. just the feeling that something real had happened and wasn't over yet. Sometimes leadership doesn't sound like a roar. It sounds like a question no one else dared to ask. AOC didn't chase applause or demand the spotlight. She simply refused to let a little girl's voice be erased. In a world obsessed with power, she chose presence. Her quiet persistence reminds us that change often begins not with shouting, but with listening. One name on a wall, one photo on a desk, one sentence that makes the room stop breathing. What about you? Have you ever seen a moment, quiet and small, that changed how you understood justice or strength? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.